Welcome everyone. It's really nice to see so many of your names popping up on the attendees list, many that I've seen over the last few weeks and a few new people. So welcome to all to British Rowing's lockdown webinar in association with British Rowing's and official analytics partner SAS, working to help you, give you the power to row. Tonight I'm really happy to be able to introduce Ben Sheath, who is an strength and conditioning coach with British Rowing and the GB Rowing team. He is going to be talking tonight about creative strength training, something which I'm sure coaches that are out there listening in, you've had to be pretty creative with your squads about how and how you keep your athletes training and different ways, and also if there's athletes on there as well, I'm sure you've found different ways and different things to lift in your household. Ben's going to talk a little bit about the science behind cessation and stopping training, and how we need to keep moving, and some science to back up some of the advice that he then gives. If you've got a question at any time, please pop that into the question panel. I'll be picking out a few at the end of the webinar and asking those to Ben. Anything we don't answer, we will chuck up on the Q&A sheet, which will go on the website at a later date in a couple of days' time. And also, this whole webinar is being recorded, as is the others that have happened so far. So if you know of someone who's missed this, or you want to check back in later, then go onto the website where you registered, and you'll find the link to be able to see this again, or publish it to someone else. So Ben, over to you, mate.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. But yeah, just thank you to yourself, Dan, and to British Rowing for asking me to present this evening. Like you said, the title is Creative Strength Training, and hopefully using a bit of science, we can unpick the effect of detraining and this lockdown period on your body from a strength perspective, and then hopefully also give you some applied sort of takeaways and ideas that you can then take back into your training and use for the remainder of this lockdown period. So, like Dan said, I'm one of a member of the strength and conditioning team with British Rowing. So I'd also like to just, before I start, just thank Nicole, Sam, and Tom Ruska, who are other members of the British Rowing team, and who have also done a lot of work in terms of the literature review that sits behind this presentation, and who I work with on a daily basis. The other part is in terms of copyright. Unless I'm in the photo, I don't actually own the photo. I've just found them pretty easy to get hold of on Google, or athletes have sent them to me. But where appropriate, I have given credit. So I don't actually own the photos, given that out there early on, but there is sort of references and credit where possible through the presentation. So I guess the big question is why we're having this talk, and that's because we can't get into wonderful facilities like this, at least for the time being. So if we start at the beginning, so why do we need to even worry about strength in rowing? So we're pretty confident that strength is a determinant of erg performance, as we know that there is a positive relationship between your strength and how you perform in the erg. We also consider it the glue. So strength is a positive in terms of injury prevention and maintaining robustness. Rowing, being the sport it is, with the high training demands, requires you to be robust in order to meet those training demands and have adequate training adherence. So you need to have strength in order to have the glue. Like Dan mentioned, we also work really closely with SAS to make sure that our data and our determinants of performance are up to date and appropriate for where we are and what training we're doing at the moment. So this is a really nice image just from Morton and his colleagues in their study in 2019. And this is just graphically represents a few of the widely agreed principles and theories around training for strength and training for hypertrophy. A couple of things to be aware of that aren't actually on this slide, that I will touch on at various points during the presentation, is around fiber types, so both type 1 and type 2 fibers, how they're different and what their different requirements and how they're activated in a different way. And also just to quickly touch on the size principle. So not going to go too heavy in the science or too deep in the physiology, but just so sort of people are aware when I talk about motor units, there's a size principle which sits behind that, which states that smaller, lower threshold motor units are recruited preferentially, and then the bigger, larger threshold motor units are recruited further down as the threshold increases. All of these that are shown on the slide, as well as the couple I've just mentioned there around fiber type and size principle, are important to consider when training normally, even more so when we're in this lockdown period that we're currently in. Now, it's a little bit of a cliche, and kind of sorry for using a cliche so early on in the presentation, but it does also hold true when it comes to physical qualities, and that is you either use it or ultimately you lose it. This is actually really nicely graphed in a table here by Isometric in his work in 2008. And if we pay particular attention to strength endurance and maximal strength, the two I've circled here, we can see that after 15 days of no training, so complete inactivity for 15 days, that strength endurance begins to decline. And then 15 days later, so after a month of not doing anything, so after 30 days, your maximal strength qualities will also begin to decline. Just to offer sort of further support on this, just a couple more studies to look at. So this is Bosque and colleagues from 2013. So they compared maximal force, which is the graph on the left, and submaximal force, which is the graph on the right. And the metric on the axes there is standard deviations away from the mean. So as you can see, we're here where I've circled. So in terms of maximal strength, although we've not reached a significant reduction in terms of standard deviations from the mean, we are seeing a marked decrease in terms of maximal strength qualities at around the 50-day mark. Similarly, but actually reaching significance on day 57 is your submax strength. So there's a significant decline in your submax muscular strength by day 57. And actually, we're not that far away from it, which is what we'll talk about in a minute. Just the last one, sort of just to badger this home, I guess. Majika and Padilla are two leaders in this field in terms of detraining and its effects. And they stated in 2003 that you can expect an 8 to 13% loss in EMG after 2 weeks of training cessation. So what this means is after 2 weeks of doing nothing, the electrical activity at the muscle is reduced by 8 to 13%. So that also indicates the muscle strength as well, having a decline after 2 weeks doing nothing. Now, like I say, we're a little bit after 2 weeks of not doing anything. Today is actually day 52 or 53, depending on when you class the first day as. So what we know is strength is really important in terms of rowing performance, especially on the erg, and it's also really important from an injury prevention perspective. So if we are now at day 52 and we've seen that strength qualities and our fitness qualities can decline after 30 days, it's probably time we start looking into what we can do about it. Especially when we consider that this is our new normal. So these are our gyms now. So our gyms are the great outdoors, looking lovely and sunny there, and a garage. It's not my garage, that's quite tidy, that garage. But the great outdoors and the garage. So what can we do in these environments? So these are just some photos from athletes in terms of how they've taken the Be Creative guideline. I think that we can agree they've taken it to a whole new level using paint pots and farm equipment, wooden blocks to replace the traditional weight plates, dumbbells, and nice comfy benches you get in most traditional gyms. I guess now's a pretty good time just to reinforce probably the message of stay safe. A lot of this presentation, I'll talk about resistance in relation to percentages of rep max or just resistance training in general. I think it's really important just that we make sure that any changes or advice you sort of take away from this is appropriate and applicable to you or the athletes you're programming for. And also make sure that you're not just trying something new with the most unstable bit of kit that you can find in your house. Although they look pretty dangerous, those photos I just showed you, they have tested them out and they're high level athletes that have managed to ensure that they're safe and well supported and they're not on their own when they're doing those. So I guess the common rule is, if you're an athlete listening, make sure you check in with your coach and they're happy with what you want to do and how you want to proceed. And if you're a coach, just make sure that whatever you program is appropriate for the level of athlete that you're working with. Okay, so if we apply that into what can we actually do? So this is a really great slide that I've taken from Alex Natera, who is a strength and conditioning coach in Australia. So bear with me because there are a few numbers on this slide, but I'll try and make it as clear as I possibly can. So they state that any mass above the hips equates to 68% of your total body weight. Your legs then equate for approximately 15% each. So theoretically, if you then move on to one leg, you're taking that whole 68% of body mass onto one leg rather than splitting it across the two. You're also taking that 15% body mass on the non-stance leg. And opposed to having a two-legged stance, you're also going to take 100% of any load added onto the body. So therefore, theoretically speaking, if you applied 0.25%, so 25%, as you can see by that red dot on the left-hand side of the graph, so if you applied 25% of body mass onto your body while doing a single leg exercise, that could potentially equate to the equivalent of a 1.5 times body weight load doing a double leg exercise. So as we can see, if we've got minimal kit and minimal load, transitioning onto single leg exercises could be a real benefit and real positive to maximize the load we do have and still improve our strength qualities. So here are a couple of photos of me demonstrating a couple of single leg exercises. So we've got a rear foot elevated split squat. In that rucksack, I've just got books, some laundry detergent, I think, just heavy things you can find around the house. I know there's a couple of other webinars on this series where people explored how you can use milk cartons and books to make weights, and really do advocate, as long as they're safe and they're sealed and you're not going to get hurt and they're nicely secured, you can find a decent amount of weight around the house and just put it into a rucksack. Also can just state that that keg is not full of beer. It was empty, borrowed from a local bar pre-lockdown. It's now full of water, so before anyone starts thinking it's just full of beer. And as you can see from the single leg squat on the right hand side there, if we're going onto one leg, what's really important is our ability to still maintain force output. So what we don't want to have is stability to be the weak link. So we don't want our core to let us down. So if we need to use a wall or a broomstick to hold on to give us a little bit of stability so we can still produce maximal force through that single leg, then that's okay as well. So if we know that we can still make changes in terms of strength, I guess it's still also important to consider how much do we need to do. So a lot of people will have more time, but a lot of people also won't have more time during lockdown. So in terms of minimal dose, Garcia and Polares in 2009 took world-class kayak athletes, and they had two groups over a 5-week period. One group did nothing, and the other group just did a reduced training, so they just did one session per week. Now that one session was high intensity, so it was 85% of their 1 repetition max, but in doing only 20% of the previous volume of training, they managed to reduce losses by 50%. And that's shown here in those numbers at the top. So they managed to only lose 3.9% of their bench press strength compared to 8.9% of the group that did nothing. And in their prone bench pull, there were losses of 3.4% compared to 7.8% in the group that did nothing. Interestingly though, they do note that you still require specific power training, and that's specific to the sport. Secondly, Ronstad in 2010 did a study into cyclists, and they also found support that just one session per week for 13 weeks preserved strength and cross-sectional area, so muscle mass, for 13 weeks. The one thing to notice here, similar to Garcia and Polares, is cycling is a highly specific action, and they used the legs and the quadriceps as their area they tested. So specificity seemingly is important. And then finally, Androulakis and Karakis in 2019 conducted a meta-analysis. They looked at all of the papers out there on the number of sets required to elicit strength improvements. Now, they found that if you're able to train at a high intensity, so a high percentage of your repetition max, single set is sufficient. However, they also note that should that not be possible, so in a situation similar to what we're in now, where we don't have a lot of load available potentially, then frequency becomes more important, and you may need 2 to 3 doses per week to have those same strength gains. They also make the subjective statement that effort is key. Now, I take that as an opportunity to consider other means to measure intensity beyond just percentage of load used. So for me, we could also look at rate of perceived exertion, so RPE, and how that relates to effort and intensity. So anything over an RPE of 7 could relate to high intensity work, and that could be sufficient at maintaining strength gains. But if I just go back and just highlight the need for specificity, both Garcia-Polares and Ronstad's papers made this clear statement that we need specificity in order to maintain and improve strength. So if we take that into rowing, so this paper by Lawton in 2013, they compared a rowing and weight training group compared to just a resisted rowing group. So if we look at this figure on the right hand side, so IP, which stands for isometric pull, we can see that just having resisted rowing, although not to the level of weight training as well, was able to maintain strength qualities in a very specific horizontal pull, so a position that we need strength in our population. So this could offer confidence that should we not have any equipment or space or anything that we could use as load, but we do have an erg available, we could still have some form of strength maintenance, although to a lesser degree, and potentially even some form of strength improvement, just from doing some highly specific resisted rowing strokes. Okay, just another methodology of training that we can look at to use. So this is isometric training. So isometric training is training whereby a force is applied externally that you cannot move. So it's a force greater than you can move. These tables are all just taken from one paper by Lum and Barbosa in 2019, where they did a meta-analysis of all the existing research into isometrics. And they clearly see, you can clearly see, and they clearly found that isometrics can be a useful tool for developing neuromuscular power, so your strength qualities, your rate of force development, so your power, your ability to produce that force, and also your cross-sectional area, so what we've talked about before, so your muscle mass. One thing to make clear here though is isometrics, as by the name, there's no movement involved. So what we need to be careful of when we're programming these is we're using a variety of different muscle lengths and angles so that we're working the muscle through the full range of movement. Now, this can be done across the same session or across multiple sessions or across a period of time, but it's something to be considerate of. Now, if we're using isometrics as a way to improve neuromuscular power, so to improve our strength, the contractions are likely to be relatively short. They're probably going to be 5 to 8 seconds long, and they're going to be maximal in terms of intensity. So this is further supported by Bem and Sales research in '93, where they've stated that intended rather than actual movement velocity determines velocity-specific training responses. So they're suggesting that even if you've got an isometric contraction, so you're not able to move the load, your intent to move that load as fast as you possibly can still can have positive high power output responses, even if the load isn't moving. Okay, so here's just a couple of examples of what you could use. So unfortunately, I don't have any boat ties or broom handles at home, but you can easily also set up some boat ties and broom handles and perform similar movements and a wider variety of them. These are just a couple of examples: an isometric row and an isometric glute bridge. Okay, so we've touched on load and specifically specificity of load in improving neuromuscular strength. We're confident that we've dealt with the need for specificity, load and how we could potentially find that, and also roughly touched on volume and required volume to elicit strength maintenance and potentially some strength gains. It is also important though that we consider hypertrophy and muscle mass. So sometimes I'll refer to it as cross-sectional area. What I mean by that is muscle mass and improving that. Now, as you can see here, that requires intensity of effort, volume, and training frequency. Now, we're relatively confident that the cross-sectional area and increases in muscle mass also has a positive relationship with the muscle's ability and a body's ability to produce force. Now, when we're improving hypertrophy or training for hypertrophy, what we're trying to do is achieve stress either at the cross bridge formation, so really localized on the individual muscle fiber, trying to induce stress there, or in response to mechanical tension. Now, given what we're talking about and the situation we're in, where we don't have a lot of load and we don't have a lot of equipment available to us, we're probably going to be preferentially favoring the cross bridge formation and stressing there. However, there are a couple of options later on that I'll explore in terms of mechanical tension and how we can play around with that with not a lot of equipment or load. Also, just like to quickly draw your attention to underneath intensive effort, it talks about volitational fatigue, which is all about training to near maximal intensity. So what you're trying to do there is reps to technical failure. So not collapsing on the floor, but just reps to you can't perform anymore with good quality in technique. So we'll touch on that in a little bit. So just like to revisit this slide. So like we've seen, you can program this slide for strength qualities, but just like we normally would program anyway for muscle mass and muscle gains, we can also use these methods and take it onto a single limb when it comes to programming for hypertrophy. We know that for hypertrophy, we need mechanical tension, we need high threshold motor unit recruitment, and we need metabolic stress. They're the holy trinity of hypertrophy, and we can achieve all of those just through normal programming, but just being considerate of how we can maximize the load that we have. Similarly, isometrics, again, all that changes here is our need for the contraction to be longer goes up, so that our contractions are less likely to be the shorter 2 to 6 second mark. They're going to be longer, nearing that 30 seconds. We want that time under tension. We need that metabolic stress. Okay, so if we move into that volitational fatigue, there's a lot of support from this in the literature. So there's a lot of people have done a lot of good work looking at reps to failure and its effects on improvements in cross-sectional area. If it's something that interests you, Brad Schoenfeld, Stu Phillips, there's some people that I'd really recommend you go and have a read of some of their work. This is from Las Vegas in 2018. And what we've got here, we've got two graphs. So the graph on the left relates to bicep muscle, and the graph on the right relates to quadricep muscle. So the numbers down the bottom, G20, G40, G60, and G80, relate to a percentage of 1 repetition maximum. So what we can see and what this graph is showing us is that just using 20% of our 1 repetition maximum, so real low load, after 12 weeks of training, we can have a significant improvement in cross-sectional area, both in our biceps and in our quadriceps. So what that suggests is we don't need a lot of load in order to improve muscle mass and hypertrophy. They train twice a week, so this is where the frequency comes in. So where load is no longer possible to elicit that strength response like we spoke about earlier, frequency becomes more key in its role into improving these physical qualities. So how does this look in practice? So if we combine isometrics and the low load training to failure, a couple of methods we could use are called elevator isometrics and myoreps. So elevator isometrics involve multiple pauses during the full range of a movement, which elicit that mechanical tension, increase time under tension, and also maximizing the metabolic stress. In doing so, you're recruiting those higher threshold motor units, and like we've talked about, that's the concoction that we need in order to elicit improvements in cross-sectional area. So in practice, that could look like in a squat, you could perform 3 10-second pauses on the way down, but you're still working through full range, and you're still working with maximal intent, especially in that concentric, the way back up. Secondly, if we look at myoreps, so myoreps use RPE as a measure of monitoring intensity. So you'd perform reps to near failure, approximately an RPE of 7. You'd rest for 10 seconds, and then you'd repeat that. So again, we're looking at those adaptive pathways that we've talked about for cross-sectional area improvements. We're maximizing time and attention. We're maximizing potential higher threshold motor unit recruitment, and we're also maximizing the metabolic stress at a muscular level. Like I've talked about a couple of times, although we're in an unusual situation in terms of our environment and our equipment available to us, some things remain pretty constant, and that's the variables that we can play around with when we're programming our S&C and our resistance training. And their volume, the frequency, the time and duration, both in terms of how long a session may be, how long a set may be, or an isometric, as we've talked about. The tempo of a movement, we've just discussed how you can play around with tempo in elevator isometrics and other movements that can incorporate isometrics, and also the load. So you may be in a lucky position where you do have load available, or you have multiple heavy objects, and you can still manipulate the load you use to elicit different responses. Ultimately, what you're looking for is progressive overload. So you want to stress the system suitably and safely to a point that it then needs to adapt. That adaptation then is the improvement. I've also put in brackets under load the mechanism. So the way in which we load and where that load is applied to the body will also have an effect on how we respond. So if you've got a heavy rucksack, how you use that heavy rucksack, whether it's on your back, on your shoulder, over your head, will also have a difference in terms of how those muscles are loaded and the output you're having at the other end of it. Okay, so here's just a quote from Hickson's paper regarding resistance training does not affect endurance as much as endurance affects resistance training. What he's describing here is the interference effect. Now, this is something I just want to touch on quickly as something else to be aware of during this period, especially when we're programming our resistance training and we're aware of trying to maximize adaptation. But it's also not a rabbit hole I want to get down into at the moment. Probably leave that for the physiologists as well. But just a real whistle-stop tour in terms of the interference effect. There are two competing pathways when we look at response to training in a real simplified fashion. You've got a pathway called the AMPK pathway, which relates to your physiology, so your endurance training, and you've got your mTOR pathway, which is your strength pathway. Now, the AMPK pathway blocks the mTOR pathway. However, the same cannot be said for the reverse. So mTOR doesn't negatively affect AMPK. Therefore, it could be suggested and theorized and advised that you lift as your last session of the day later in the evening. In doing so, you're less likely to have interference from the endurance AMPK pathway, and the mTOR pathway is also going to be open for longer, which means the window for adaptation and your potential improvements in cross-sectional area and muscular strength will last for longer as well. Now, this isn't always possible, and I appreciate that sometimes this comes down to it depends or a situationally specific case, and it may be that you need to train in the morning for whatever reason. And it's not that you won't get any improvements at all, it's just things to be aware of. So advice would be that make sure you've got enough time between waking and doing any lifting or resistance training so that you're safe and your body is prepared to do so, you've properly fueled, etc. And also, in doing so, it enables you to have that intent. So we've discussed intent a few times, and Ben and Sale's study showing how important intent was at maximizing adaptation. You need to have that intent, and to have intent, you need to have been awake for a little while, not fresh out of bed, and your body needs to have warmed up as well. Also, if you need to lift in the morning, it's important to consider when you're going to then plan in your next session. Maybe it might be your erg session or your aerobic session. And the research suggests, again, that ideally you'd have 6 hours between those sessions. Now, like I say, I don't want to get into a physiologist sort of zone here. I'm very much trying to just stick to the strength, but it is important to note that if we can, when we're already having to make a few compromises in terms of our resistance training and equipment available and facility that we're training in, if we can maximize adaptation and stimulus by putting it in the evening or in the afternoon and as our last session, I definitely would recommend trying to do that. But if we can't, it's not the end of the world. It's just a couple of things to consider around the scheduling of the rest of our day and the rest of our week. So just before we go a little bit further and we round up, I just want to recap a few key points. So moving on to one limb maximizes mechanical tension and the load we do have available. And it also enables us to recruit those higher threshold motor units. Isometrics are a great tool when we've got very limited equipment. Like you saw in the photos, I just used a towel, and you can maximize adaptation in terms of rate of force development, neuromuscular power and strength, and also cross-sectional area. They're a great tool to use when it comes to low load and low equipment training. It's a word I keep saying over and over, but intent is still important. So even if we don't have a lot of load, your intent to move that load quickly can have massively positive effects in your rate of force development and your subsequent muscular power. So move things quickly, have intent to move forcefully and powerfully. We've touched briefly on specificity and the need for specificity. We've looked at an example from Lawton where powerful rowing strokes protected upper back pulling strength. That could be an option, and it's something to think about, especially if the equipment you do have is relatively limited. We've also talked about how we can utilize and maximize low load but high volume training to improve cross-sectional area. We know that having greater muscle mass enables you to produce more force. So is this an opportunity when we don't have a lot of load and we're potentially a little bit more rested? Is this an opportunity to improve our cross-sectional area? Is this an opportunity to improve our lean mass and subsequently improve our ability to produce force? It's something to think about. And then finally, the manipulation of training programs. So we've talked about the interference effects and how, although we're already making a compromise in terms of equipment and facility and many other things in this lockdown period, can we maximize adaptation just by changing our day around a little bit and changing our week around? So we're still getting that maximal physiological response to the training we are doing. And just quickly before we finish, what happens if we do nothing? So this is another rowing paper by Godfrey in 2005 that looked at the effect of 8 weeks of complete inactivity after the Olympic Games and how long that then took to return. So if we focus our attention here at what's produced, you can see that it took 20 weeks to return to pre-Olympic game levels after 8 weeks of inactivity. So we're actually on week 8 right now. So if we're on week 8 and we've already potentially lost over 100 watts, according to this Godfrey paper, it's going to take us over 20 weeks to get back. So if you're a healthy adult that's wondering what they could do in order to maintain their erg performance that we've shown strength plays a part in, and also maintain your robustness and enable yourself to jump back into training as and when we're allowed to do so and stay in one piece, it's probably hopefully a good opportunity, and hopefully you've got some ideas there as to what you could do around the house to keep your strength training going. And then finally, just to reiterate this message, it's really important that whatever you go and do, it's appropriate to the level you're at. So coaches, like I say, make sure you're programming appropriate levels of complexity and intensity for the athletes you're working with. Athletes, make sure that you're attempting something that is safe in terms of equipment, but also the intensity and complexity is appropriate to your level. And one thing I've not really touched on through it is juniors, and I think this is a fantastic opportunity for juniors, if you're athletes listening or coaches of juniors listening, to improve your movement quality. You don't need any load, you don't even need a lot of space, and you can really improve the fundamental technical skill of those key movement patterns. It's a massive opportunity for that, which in turn will enable them to be more robust. They'll be able to move through better positions, they'll be more coordinated, and in turn that will help improve their performance. So we don't need lots of load, we don't need lots of stress if that's not the level we're at, or if that's not suitable for our age and competition level. So just stay safe, make sure it's appropriate for you, and athletes always speak to a coach or a professional, and juniors, just make sure you keep working on those movement patterns as well. That's me in terms of strength training and trying to be creative during this lockdown period. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, and appreciate a fair bit of science, so hopefully it's useful.
Hi Ben. So now, as you say, is the time for questions. You've obviously been rattling through things, and I'll give people a little bit of time to take some stuff on, because I haven't actually had any questions come in as we've been going through the webinar. But just while we'll wait a little while to see if anything comes in. I just wanted you to go over practical examples of what you meant by intent or movement intent when you're talking about isometric contractions?
Yeah, no worries. So what I mean by that is, so those towel examples I gave, it's wanting to, although you're not going to be able to move the load or the towel, it's still applying the same amount of force to it as if you're trying to move it. So you need to move maximally as hard as you can and contract things as hard as you can, even if you're not going to be able to move it, because that's what will recruit the higher threshold motor units, and it's those that are really important when it comes to strength and cross-sectional area improvements.
And for like athletes at home or coaches trying to prescribe something, could you use a scale? And I'm only just thinking off the top of my head here. Could you use the scale such as like rate of perceived exertion or something like that to measure that just consciously?
Oh yeah, definitely. So like I said, in one of the papers, they refer to effort, which is relatively subjective and a little bit fluffy, I guess. But I took that as, yeah, using RPE, so rate of perceived exertion. And I think if we consider 10 is the hardest possible activity you could do, high intensity, sort of your 7 and 8s, they're pretty high intensity. And what you're looking at achieving there is your shorter duration isometrics or contractions, where you're trying to produce a lot of force pretty quickly to improve your strength capabilities. You're probably looking at an 8 or 9, but over a very short period of time. And those longer, more grind type isometrics, where you're looking at improving cross-sectional area or muscle mass, they're going to be more like a 7. So they're going to be slightly lower in terms of perceived exertion because they just last a little bit longer, but your intent stays the same. It just happens over a longer period of time.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks for answering my question. We've got a few coming now, so we'll start off with. Could you explain more about the elevator isometric contractions again?
Yeah, I kind of whistled over that. So if we use a squat, for example, so the way this could be performed is, say you're going to have 3 10-second holds. So at 3 different levels on the way down of a squat, you would pause for 10 seconds. So in one movement, on one repetition, you'd have 30 seconds worth of pause work in there. So you'd still work through the full range of a squat, but you may pause a quarter of the way down, half the way down, and right at the bottom, you're going to pause for 10 seconds, and then you're going to come back up with that maximal intent through the full range. And then you just repeat that like you normally would with sets and reps and your normal programming. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, good. Right, so a couple have come in around the same topic. So I'll, as I say, any questions we don't answer, or if I will hand all of your questions as they are written over to Ben, so he can read into them. But I'll try and just put 2 together here. So you mentioned about being specific rowing actions, and you mentioned about them on the ergo regarding doing some ergo work and pulls and things like that. Could you give some more examples of what you meant by that, just a little bit more deeper about what exercises you could do on the ergo, or if that's exactly what you meant regarding drag and that kind of thing?
Yes, I think just increasing the resistance, so power strokes with increased resistance on the erg. So in that actual Lawton paper, it's actually done in the water using bungees and resisted rowing. But I think the same can be inferred in terms of taking across onto the ergo. So if you just increase the resistance and use it like power strokes, so we're not trying to complete a piece or a UG2 piece. It's short, but like we keep talking about, maximal intensity efforts where you're trying to pull against big drag and big resistance. Then that could potentially have a protective effect on muscle strength, especially specific localized pulling strength.
Brilliant. Okay. Right. Let's. Okay. So this is more about strength and conditioning while you're on here. Just in general. So I think this is quite important for those people that are here that maybe might be starting their strength and conditioning journey. Would you train speed, strength, power, and hypertrophy together, or program them as a single characteristics?
Yeah, I could give you the real good get out of jail free card of it depends answer. I think for me, it's making sure you've got a really clear focus for what you're trying to achieve. So if you've got a specific adaptation or outcome that you want to achieve, I think I'd be really specific and get after that. There's obviously cases, times, and scenarios where you can potentially try and target 2 adaptations, but often what you could end up going down a bit of a muddy hole of trying to achieve too much and actually not achieving anything. So I'd probably be pretty specific and focused on what the actual changes you want to make, and then get after that.
Brilliant. Right, I'm glad we've got time because they're flooding in now. Right, breathing patterns. How important are they? Activating breathing patterns.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, really important. So if we took a squat, for example, so slightly different, I guess, in this scenario when we're probably not going to have a lot of actual loads. We're not going to put a lot of load onto us, but we sort of consider a normal environment as well. So breathing correctly maintains intra-abdominal pressure, which then can help maintain spinal health as well. So it's really important that we're not sort of releasing that intra-abdominal pressure by breathing out partway through the movement. So for me, correct breathing pattern for a squat would be a big breath in at the top, really get that intra-abdominal bracing, that pressure around our midsection, maintain that breath through the movement, and then breathe out and repeat at the top of the movement again. So it is really important around pressure, and in some movements more important than others, especially around maintaining sort of posture and spinal health as well. But there's probably physiologists and breathing people that may be a little bit more well versed than me on that, but that'd be my take.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, I'm just going to keep moving on with these. So a couple of people, obviously the isometric stuff has really hit home with a few people. The question actually is, do you have a sample isometric training plan that you would be willing to share? Now that's one point, but also there's a few people asking for more rowing specific exercises that are isometric. So I don't know if you could kind of think of a few that you might be able to put now, and if there is something that you felt that you could put together, obviously with GB rowing looking over it and stuff like that, and probably the technical panel to look over it as well, but before it went out. But you know, is there a few exercises that you could give now?
Yeah, I think there's 2 parts to that really. I think you can be pretty creative with isometrics. Unfortunately, I don't have bow ties, but I'm sure a lot of you guys will have bow ties and wooden dowels and stuff at home as well. You can pretty much replicate any gym movement you'd normally do just in an isometric fashion. If you use bow ties and strap them to a wooden dowel and then stand on them, for example, you can pretty much get into any posture or pattern that you normally would do. So sort of have a play and explore on those. I don't have a specific isometric program that I can just give out. I think there's lots of examples on YouTube and online. Alex Notera is worth a bit of a look across, but he's a bit more running specific. He's from an Aussie rules at AFL and background rather than rowing or our sport. I think in terms of rowing specific movements, I think it's important to consider what we're trying to change and what we're trying to elicit. So right at the beginning of the presentation, I talked around how strength is important for erg performance and subsequent robustness and training adherence. But what we're actually looking at there is the body's ability to produce force. Now, when we're considering the body's ability to produce force, we're probably looking at our legs' ability to produce force, our hips, and then ultimately our pull, I guess, is our key areas where we need to be strong. Now, if they're the key areas where we need to be strong, although they may not look like a rowing stroke, I think you can still set yourself up and use towels and pulleys and what have you to manipulate your body into those positions and contract against unmovable objects. Like I said, I don't have anything I can just give out, but there are some good tools in terms of isometrics and what have you online, and I'm happy to share any research papers as well. So that Lamb and Barbosa study, they outline a couple of the methodologies used by those researchers, so I'm happy to share those if that'd be interesting to people.
Yeah, what we could do, Ben, is maybe either chuck links to them or put them on the Q&A sheet that gets put on the website after this webinar. That's probably where we'll put them. Great, right. Any benefits to very high rep exercises, such as exercises that go into the hundreds?
Ooh. Yeah, it's a good question. I think if you take the research into high rep, low load training literally, I think what you're looking for is volitational fatigue. So if you can achieve that at 100 reps, then I guess you're getting what you're trying to target. I think there probably comes a little bit of a question in terms of appropriateness of load and actually how well you're then recruiting those higher threshold motor units. So if they require relatively strong stimulus to be recruited, you probably do need more load than you'd be lifting for 100 reps in order to recruit them to elicit those changes or those adaptations. So although if you took the research potentially literally, you could see there's an argument for that. For me personally, I think I would consider time benefits and also is there a potentially more efficient way using a little bit more load, granted, that we could elicit the recruitment of those higher threshold motor units, create mechanical tension, and also create metabolic stress that's needed for those adaptations we've talked about.
Brilliant. Right, so we'll answer two more. So let's just have a quick look at two that I think. Okay, so again, something about S&C in general, I think, and maybe being something sport specific. But in your opinion, Ben, what would you want an athlete? Would you want an athlete to be doing multi-joint movements as opposed to singular joint? And he gives an example, squats as opposed to a bicep curl. If so, what would you cite as the best exercise?
The best exercise? Oh, that could get me in trouble with some people. I would definitely go yes on the multi-joint. Although I would also add the traditional "it depends" caveat onto that. If you're trying to make really localized change on a specific muscle, then that's where the isolated single joint movements come in, and they're really positive. So if you're trying to really attack a quadricep for whatever reason that athlete needs it, a leg extension is going to be a beneficial tool because it's going to really target that holy trinity that we talked about: the metabolic stress, the tension, and the motor unit recruitment. But if we're just looking from an athletic perspective and just general training, then I would go down the route of multi-joint for sure. Best exercise is a good question. I don't know if there's a best exercise just in general in sort of general training. I think that one probably does depend a little bit on what your outcome is. I could go for a favorite exercise. I think a favorite exercise for me would probably be a trap bar deadlift or a clean. That's just my personal favorite. But I don't know if there's a best. I think you'd probably have to accept that it depends answer on that one, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Okay. So last one, and then if you've got anything else to say, then of course, Ben, it's your evening, or if not, then I'll wrap up. But some schools and rowing club management classify strength and conditioning, which they think of as purely weight training, as a very high risk activity and ban it. You know, what are your thoughts on that? And maybe can you give any tips for a coach who might be approaching management to talk about strength and conditioning and how they might approach that?
Yeah, I think it's really important that it's carried out by qualified people or people have a good understanding of it. Obviously, we've got the UKSCA, the UK Strength and Conditioning Association, who act as a standard bearer in terms of S&C coaches and their practice. You've also got other weightlifting and S&C qualifications out there, which give you confidence and a good grounding in how to be safe. And I think that's really important, just to have some form of knowledge base on it, so you're not going to be doing anything that isn't safe or applicable to that population. I also think it's a really important tool. there's loads and loads of great practitioners working in the youth setup and in schools and colleges, maybe not necessarily just in rowing, but across loads of different sports, that have really, really great setups and systems for youth athletes, and it's worth trying to find those guys and having a look at those and potentially using their work as examples of what you could do, because S&C doesn't need to look like back squats and bench press for everyone. It's about improving someone's athleticism, and athleticism is a bit of a buzzword, but there's also a lot of good research by Rodri Lloyd, John Oliver, and lots of other people around athleticism and long-term athlete development. So I think that's a bit of a ramble answer, but the short answer would be make sure you're qualified and experienced enough to be safe doing it, because it is important. It's not just, you can't just go into a gym because you like going into a gym and kind of coach someone. I think there's lots of qualifications and resources out there, both through British Rowing as well as through externals, that can give you that understanding and that confidence. And then I think also just make sure that maybe they know and you know, or whoever you're trying to pitch it to, it's not just barbells and dumbbells. When it comes to S&C, it's about movement quality and improving that, because that ultimately is what leads to robustness and ability to load later on when it becomes more appropriate. Does that answer the question, Dan?
I think that answers it really well, Ben. Yeah, thanks very much. Ben, have you got any closing points that you want to make that's come into your mind while we've been answering questions?
I don't think so. I think hopefully it's been useful. Thank you very much again for having me on. Appreciate it was a little bit sort of numbers and science parts in there, so sorry for that. But hopefully there's some bits that you can take away. And yeah, if you've got any lingering questions, we'll do that Q&A sheet that we spoke about, Dan, or I've got my personal Twitter. You're more than welcome to contact me on down there if you've got any questions. And like I just said, I'm happy to share any sort of references that I've used through it, so you can go try and look up for those papers, whatever, but we can work out a way of doing that afterwards. But yeah, no, just thank you very much.
Brilliant. Just one thing from me, if you follow British Rowing on social media, they have put up a poll today. I think it's on Twitter, it may be on other platforms as well, regarding this webinar series. As we move out of lockdown, we will be changing how we run this series. By name will be one of them, but it won't be twice a week. So we're looking to get some information from you about when you would best want these during the week. So yes, if you could fill that poll out, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, it's just for me to say thank you to British Rowing's official analytics partner, SAS, for their support of this lockdown webinar series. Thank you again to Ben, and thank you to all of you for supporting this webinar series. Many of you are continuing to return and get information out and asking great questions and give us new ideas for future webinars, so keep those coming in as well. And yeah, thank you for attending again tonight. Take care, and I hope you're all safe.
Thank you.